I'm very happy to be at Duke. I've got to interact with many of the audience, hopefully more to come as I come here. I've been working with Duke and Duke surgeons for probably the last 5-6 years, so it's kind of nice to come here and really especially to come in and start to work with some of the engineering faculty that I haven't been with. So I'll get right into things, and I've kind of got an introduction. It's a weird introduction slide, but it's just a plot. This is called an Ashby plot, for those of you who know the area or not. And it basically is a plot of, on the bottom is stiffness, so the modulus, and this is for people that don't know, this is just a measure of the material, how difficult it is to reversibly deform. So if something's very stiff, feels very rigid, it's very compliant, it's very flexible like a rubber band. On the left is a measure called toughness. And toughness is a way to measure strength that also gives you a measure of how strong something is or how difficult it is to break this. That also incorporates sort of the energy that it can absorb. So you might have something that's very, very strong, but it's brittle. And some things like that, it won't be very tough. And the materials in the human body, the synthetic materials, are often, they span a very large range of stiffness, and they also tend to be thought of as very tough materials, tough that can absorb energy and actually can have very high strength and strain. So the motivation for my work that I'm going to show you is kind of in this plot. What I've got plotted here is I've got tendon, which is one of the softer tissues in your body. There's softer ones than that. And then bone. So you can see bone's a couple orders of magnitude stiffer than you would see tendon. Tendon's about as tough as bone, and part of the reason for that is tendon is not as strong, but it can deform very large amounts. And so it has a capacity to absorb a lot of energy, similar to bone, but in a different type. And what I've plotted on top of this is all of the materials, the synthetic materials that are used in the human body today, not including some of the materials we put in. And so what you see is actually synthetic materials are generally tougher than most of the materials we have in the human body. Part of the reason you need that is materials in the human body have another feature: they can heal themselves. Right? And so this is something we have to combat. If we put something synthetic in, we have to actually be even stronger than what we put in the body. The other is there's a wide range of stiffnesses. So you often hear people say, hey, can I make this material match the properties of human tissue? And the answer is yes. Actually, we've been able to do that for many decades. Right? And so you can really find any material that's already being used and sort of match the stiffness or match the strength. So a lot of my research is centered on how do we go beyond that? How do we go beyond just matching the stiffness or strength of the material and give it some functionality where it does something else besides carries a structural load, but it might serve some other function, either helping bone grow, adjusting to the bone when it grows, or eluting some kind of drug. So we try to look at materials and sort of bring out a different functionality in addition to their structural role. The common theme of all the stuff I'll show you is all the materials this is all orthopedics, so all kind of skeletal reconstructions. And we also all these materials have to bear loads. They're not like, for example, if you made a tissue scaffold for kidney replacement, you're probably not as concerned about the capacity of it to bear load as you might something that's going to reconstruct. So that's kind of a little bit of the motivation. The way I've set this thing up is 6 short stories. They're going to be really, really short. And so I've tried to make each story so at one part of the story you're going to go, wow, that's interesting, and another part you're going to go, I have no idea what he's talking about. And so we're trying to go really, really deep for a second, and then get out of the rut and then sort of show where it has an application. Okay, so there should be a part that you all will understand at all points, and then to try to make myself look like an expert, I'll try to lose you for a real quick spot. Here's the 6 stories. I'll pass stuff around as I go through them. First one is shape rendering polymers, next one's alloys, next one's 3D printed materials. Then we'll talk about spinal fusion, and the fourth one, and then last is soft tissue repair. So let's start with the first one. This is ACL reconstruction. Has anyone had an ACL reconstruction in here? Usually you get 1 or 2, and I'm proud about this big. And so, very common procedure, large market, often happens to athletes, sometimes non-athletes. But what happens in ACL reconstruction is you tear the ligament that's in between. It's in the center of your knee, between your tibia and your femur. And this ligament tears. It'd be nice to just reattach it. It's a very short ligament, so you'd actually, to try and recreate a new one, you'd be recreating a very short ligament. The difficulty is to reattach it, you really got to put a longer one in and then try and fix that to the bone. So the way they do ACL reconstruction is they drill a tunnel into your femur and your tibia. They put a graft up that tunnel, this is to reconstruct it, and then they have to fix it. and they fix it using that screw that's there. So they make a tunnel, they put a tendon in this tunnel, it's coming out, and they screw a screw in. So if you're watching the surgery, there's actually the patient's doing that literally moving back and forth, and they're putting this screw in and this thing goes. The problem with the screw is, not surprisingly, it really damages the tendon. You can see a little bit there, but this is just a picture from a paper. Lots of people have recognized this problem, not a lot of people have solved it, that you're trying to regrow this tissue, but at the same time you're fixing it, you're damaging it. So you have a problem where you don't want to do that. So our concept was, well, we're working on these materials. They're called shape memory polymers. These materials can reconfigure their shape, so you program them into a temporary shape, you place them somewhere, and then you expand them or change their shape. So the idea was, could we use this to replace the screw? So instead of screwing a screw into this tunnel, which if you're a mechanical engineer, a screw in a tunnel that's too small for it creates an interference bit, right? And these are not surprisingly called interference screws. Most surgeons don't know the history of why that's called that, but that's what they're all called. And so what you can create an interference bit by pushing this a plug up there and having the plug expand. So that was our concept. And this was we were at the time when the surgeon showed me ACL reconstruction, I was working on these polymers, so it was kind of serendipitous. And so let me play this, that's something else. So this is a video of a shape memory polymer. That's kind of like a demo we made where we said, all right, we have a glass tube which simulates a tunnel in your knee, that would be up in your tibia. We could place this polymer, we could let the body heat activate this polymer, it would shorten itself and expand itself, create a fit, and lock that tendon in. Okay? And like all good ideas, we had our first drawing of the concept, that was it. And it's a really, really embarrassing drawing, but I show it to show you how early stuff looks when you draw some. This is like the napkin drawing. We said, here's our concept. We're going to put that device in a rocket ship. I don't know what the drawing looks like a rocket. We're going to place it up in there, and then the very fancy color scheme is to show you it heats up and expands and locks the tendon. Okay, so that was our first thing. And unfortunately, I did show a lot of people this drawing, so I can't hide it at this point. That was the concept. Where does the basic science come in? Well, the difficulty with this problem, and actually of all the problems I'll show you, this one involves probably the most basic science, is you have to answer a lot of these questions. And so if we make this polymer, can we scale it up? Will it have enough strain? Can it expand enough? Right? Can it activate fast enough? Will the polymer, when we put it at body temperature, will the triggering mechanism be quick enough? Will it provide enough force? So it'd be one thing to expand it, and is it going to push hard enough? If it doesn't push hard enough, the tendon just slips out, right? You get your ACL reconstruction, you go home, and then tendon slips out. That's a really bad outcome. So the other thing is there's some other small details like it has to be biocompatible, has to have a long-term stability, which is kind of a related to biocompatibility, and a very tiny one is if we solve all these problems, can we clear it through the FDA? So just to give you an idea, I'm not going to cover all this because this would be sort of just one talk. So I'll show you just to give an idea of the amount of science we did. That was at MS. That was 3 PhDs. That was a PhD, another PhD, a postdoc because he wanted to solve the second problem, and then another PhD. So these were difficult problems to solve. This one had no PhDs but took $10 million. So decide which is worse. I'll leave that for them. Both were very difficult. So just a couple ideas of the type of research we did, and just to give you an idea of the basic science. What we started looking at, and this is a glass transition curve, it tells you the stiffness of the polymer as a function of temperature. And shape memory polymers work by using that transition. You package them at the high temperature, then you cool them into the low temperature, so you go back and forth in that transition. We were able to tune the polymer chemistry in a way to adjust the stiffness of that material. Our theory was that if the material was stiffer, it would push harder when it was deployed. And we ultimately verified that to be true. And that's just because the entropic forces of a rubbery material tend to make the material push harder if you are recovering it in a shape memory polymer. And so the data on the right shows we could tune how hard that polymer would push. We could make it stiffer, and that way when it recovered, it would push harder. We had some, it was interesting when I started showing this to surgeons, there were some that were saying, well, could it push so hard and blow the knee up? Or what if it's cold, will it go back? And there's all kinds of crazy questions that were things we had to address as we kind of went through. So that was some of the basic science. We then went into a long study working with chemists trying to figure out, all right, if we fix the stiffness, right? We know we fix how stiff it is, that's how hard it pushes. How do we get it to actually recover more strain? And what we found was these things can be related, and they are related. So if you make it much stiffer, you can't deform it as much. Well, now the problem is it going to reach far enough to hold the tendon? And so we went through this study where we started optimizing and figuring out which chemistries would give us, at a given stiffness, better strength. And that turned out to be a non-trivial problem. We did it kind of with a combinatorial approach where we mixed in a whole bunch of systems people hadn't looked at and came up with some of this data. So we used a lot of this data to then finally design a device. And I'm going to take a massive step forward and show you what we ultimately came out with due to many different things, because I want to kind of keep moving through the little short stories. This is what the final device looks like. And I'll pass it around. This is like once you have a startup company, there's music on there too. That I'm not going to play. I'll just send this around. This is actually the gun that deploys the device. We found out that you can't use temperature to deploy it. Surgeons are too anxious. And so we had to have something that they feel like they're doing. That's what this does. With the material's kind of, we call it the assistance, but it's really just the way the surgeon knows that something's happening. And then this is the device. We ended up having a two-part system that kind of expands it. In the end, it does the same thing we originally envisioned. It just doesn't look exactly the same, and we kind of solved a whole bunch of basic science problems to kind of get to that. So that one, I'm going to stop with that and kind of go to the next one. This is the final sort of picture of what we started with. What this device allows us to do is we slide this device in. The surgeon triggers it. It opens up and presses the tendon against the tunnel, but then doesn't leave the thread marks. And of course, you get a lot of other questions from surgeons like, that's great, how do I take it out? We have a procedure for that, the non-scientific things. Just to give you an idea of impact, I'm going to go down in product impact in terms of number. We've done about 7,000 surgeries with this product. So we've done about 7,000 ACL surgeries successfully. Not all successfully. Okay, we're going to keep switching gears and kind of keep the short stories going. Hopefully you like that type of approach, otherwise you're really going to dislike my talk. So here's a totally separate problem. And ACL reconstructions often happen in fairly healthy patients, especially ones that are active in sports. Hindfoot fusion is a procedure that happens. It's not always the healthiest patient, or it's someone who's really gotten older, and it's typically a problem where you have really, really bad arthritis in your foot. And a lot of people haven't thought about this, and I'm not here to try to get scared about other things that can go wrong, but arthritis of the foot is actually a very serious problem. And if you have arthritis of the knee or the hip, you get usually a total hip or a total knee eventually if it gets bad enough. In the foot and ankle, total ankles work to some degree, but there's a high failure rate of total ankles. And there's a lot of loading down on the foot, and so there's some challenges with keeping the ankle working. It's not often the synthetic materials that fail in these cases, often it's the materials that are holding to the synthetics. Your synthetic material might give off something or cause the bone to fail. So hindfoot fusion, the problem there is if you say, hey, you go to the doctor, say, I have really bad arthritis in my foot, I'd like to get it fixed. They will say, here are your three options. This is what's current state of the art. You can have your foot amputated. That option doesn't sound so good. And if the doctor tells you that's your only option, go somewhere else, or at least try. So that's one. The second is you get a total ankle. I told you the failure rates of those are difficult, and so you have to decide if you want to have that surgery, have it fail, and have another. The last one is hindfoot fusion. That's where they put a metal rod up the back of your foot and then fuse the joint so you cannot move your calcaneus relative. And that makes your foot is straight. So you have a small limp at that point because you can't articulate your foot. The problem with those three choices is, first one, foot's gone. Second one, really high failure rate. The other one, when I say really high, I mean really high because this failure rate of the third one, which is the best option, is about 50%. So that means you're going to go in, and guess what happens if that fails repeatedly? You're back to option one. Okay, so this is not a problem that affects a super large population of people, but it is a significant problem if you have it. And so this is a recent literature, this is a recent article showing that as high as 50% failure, and this is some of the best surgeons in the world. Those of you that work with surgeons, or if you are surgeons, you know that if you're admitting a 50% failure rate, things are not good. Generally don't like to publish that things are going that bad. So one of the surgeons approached me and said, The problem I'm having with this is I go in, I put this nail in, and then the patient comes back and says, I'm in pain. And by the way, when you go to fuse something, you kind of take all the cartilage out and push all the bones together. If it's not holding the bones together, the bones are rubbing, right? And that's what arthritis is going on both sides. So the surgeons were telling me that patients come back, I go in, they say, I'm in pain, the thing hurts. They go back, the doctor would open them back up, and the nail's loose. And the surgeon was asking me, hey, you know a lot about metals. Is this metal like stretching or something happening to it over time? Is it creeping? They looked up creep, which was an impressive step. I said, probably not unless the patient's leg gets to like 800 degrees centigrade, so probably not creep. And so what we concluded was it's really the adjustment of the bones that's the problem, right? The bones are doing something and the nail doesn't move. The nail's very rigid, staying the same way. So our concept was, well, we have these shape memory alloys, why don't we put a material that can stretch and adapt into the foot, so that when the foot starts to change, the metal moves with it. And so that's what a shape memory alloy is. It's a metal that can stretch and adapt itself. And so it kind of works like a rubber band. This is a video of it being loaded. I'll pass this around when I get to the device. So that's intact, right? It looks like rubber. And so this is material that I'm going to pass around in a second, but basically it's very, very flexible and will pop itself back. And so it can stretch not quite as much as a rubber band, but it can stretch about 10%, which is a pretty large amount for metal. So concept number 2, we came in and said, and this is also a drawing, a surgeon drew this, which is actually the worst drawing I've ever seen of a foot. I'll get into other details, but the main problem is it only has 4 toes. But I think if you look at this, the concept was, let's make this whole nail out of nitinol, we'll put it in, we can stretch it, we can have it act, and it'll adjust itself. We found out through many different things that was a problem, because if you made the whole device out of this, so if you made this entire device out of the stretching material, this whole thing, and we cemented it, it could apply about 5 tons, which is way too much force for your foot. So we found out that we're probably going to have to make it out of titanium, which is inert, and then somehow put the rubbery band material inside. Well, we were really proud of ourselves. We thought we were the first people to think of doing this. We're like, wow, like, no one has thought of this. Like, if no one could actually do this for fracture fixation. And we found out that the reason was it was thought of so long ago we couldn't find it. So it was in 1970, there was a surgeon from Johns Hopkins who was doing research and said, this material would be perfect for fusions and fractures. We could put it across the joints, stretch it, and put it on there. And the question is, okay, 1970, what happened? Why did no one do it for all these years? Well, and there's a lot of different reasons for it, but 30 years later, there was no device based on this person's research. And there was a couple reasons. One was he concluded the same thing we did, which made me not very proud of myself at that point, 30, 40 years ago, which was it's too strong. If you make the whole device out of this stuff, it's too strong, it just crushes everything. The second thing was, if you try to do what we did, which is you machine it into a small part, it's an extremely difficult material to machine. And so the problem with machining of it, when you go in to cut it, it hardens and strengthens itself and it breaks the tool off, or wears the tool super fast. So, and it's very flexible, so it's as a machinist, one in the room, you would know that if the material's flexible and very hard, that's the worst case scenario. And so what it ends up doing is making it hard to make this device with 2 parts. So we were doing research at the time, and this went back to some of my PhD work into my initial work as a faculty member, at how do you make this material machinable? And right here on the left side are transmission electron microscope images of nickel titanium. The TEM is just a way to look at the microstructure in a very, very high resolution way. And people at the time were using what's called cold-drawn nickel titanium. And that would mean all the processes they applied to steels, they just applied the same ones to nitinol. And the cold drawing was actually, if you look at that picture, if you're looking in the upper left, you say, I have no idea what that is. It looks like junk. That's what it is, junk. There's just not a good microstructure in there. The problem with the microstructure is it's very dirty. It has lots of defects and lots of residual martensite, which is very hard phase, and you can't very easily. Now it has the properties you want, which is on the right, but on the microstructure it's very hard. We started doing research saying, well, why are we cold drawing this material? Why do we have to do that to get its properties? And I wish I had recordings of the conversations I had with some of these people, but the experts were all telling me at the time, that doesn't work if you don't cold draw it. That's the way it is. That's the only way it can be done. It was, well, I was getting the sort of, this is no knowledge. And so we started this path and we said, well, why don't we precipitation harden it instead? And so those who know metallurgy, precipitation hardening is another way to strengthen the metal. And when you precipitation harden, you make a fine distribution of second phases. And this provides the hardening. And our concept was, let's just precipitation harden it rather than call this junk in there. And that's what we got on the bottom. And we call that the hot roll. And that's just a TM image showing that there's kind of a faint thing. And there's a really nice starry picture in the corner. That's the diffraction pattern. That shows you that we've created a precipitated structure there. And what we found was that had the exact same properties, actually better properties than the other material people have been using up to date. And so the really exciting thing, and if you know anything about precipitation hardened materials, the nice thing about those is you can reversibly turn them on and off. So you can solutionize them, make them soft, work with them, and then reharden them. And so that's what we ended up doing with nitinols. We turned it into a material we could reharden. And so that way we could make it machinable. So I'll show you the final device, and I'm going to pass this around. This is the final device. It's a nail with the rubber band piece in the middle. This is very hard to machine normally in a very difficult to machine material. We machine this classically, then we reharden it back into the hardened state. And this became a large center. A lot of my basic science research in my early career was centered around how do we figure out how to do this processing and get the properties back. Final device, I'll give you another. This one's also video. The videos are going to get worse and worse as we get into as we get less along. This video has no music, so and then the next will be no video, then it'll be back to drawing. So this kind of shows how the device works. But basically, it goes up into the foot. And you put this in here, and then when it's inside the body, you actually come in here and stretch that element. I think it'll show it here in a second. And so the nail gets put up there. You come in, they're going to zoom in here. You stretch the element, and then you fix all the screws. So that element is preloaded across the joint. Right? And then what happens that's really cool is in a normal nail, which will be on the left, when the bones resorb, which I think is a little video here like this, the one on the left just creates a gap. The one on our nail will shorten itself to adjust to that gap. And that was our theory that would improve the fusion rates. I can tell you that like many things, I had many people tell me this is not going to work. The fusion rates, you can never heal some of these patients. These patients it's the bad bone that's doing it. It's only biology. It's not any mechanics. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I think it's all mechanics, but there's probably a little biology in there too. But this is sort of like this won't work. So that device was cleared by the FDA in 2012. This is 2015. We just made it to the cover. Ignore that little foot on the right there. That's not us. We just made it to the cover of Foot and Ankle with Dr. Sam Adams, so a surgeon at Duke, because we have been able to fuse some cases where this was a case study where the person had not been able to fuse for several years. We put our nail and they're immediately able to fuse. And so we have a whole bunch of cases like that. This is my first cover article on non-science. Well, I guess it's scientific, but the different type of science. I'll give you one example case. Just to give you a little bit of idea. Here's one, and by the way, I don't have too many graphic images. I decided to tone down the images. Here's one that's an example of someone. This is a 66-year-old man. Not the guy on the cover of the Foot and Ankle thing. It was a Smith & Nephew nail. Smith & Nephew is a very large medical device company. They make a traditional titanium nails, no internal element. 6 months of bone stimulation, which means they were doing all kinds. They had biologics in there, doing bone stimulation, doing all kinds of things. No fusion. And what happens when you don't get fusion in orthopedics and you have hardware in there? Hardware breaks, right? That's always the path, right? If you put supportive hardware in and the hardware does not ultimately, the bone doesn't create a union, the hardware will break, and you can see that there. See that screw that's like this? That's not supposed to be like this. Okay? And that means that the fusion didn't occur, so the talus just recollapsed upon itself. We took this exact same patient, so this is an N of 1, but we have about 20 cases like this. Took this exact same patient, put our nail in, and this person fused in 4 months fully, all the bones fused. In my opinion, that's the strongest data you could have. You take the same patient with the same conditions. A lot of these people are smokers, diabetic. I'm going to tell you, they didn't change their habits. So when we put our nail in, it wasn't like they just stopped all that. And so we now have a clinical study going on at Duke tracking why some of this is and trying to figure out what, we believe it's because of the element, but we're tracking at Duke. And the really cool thing is for these type of things, the surgeon, when they take x-rays, they can track the position of the slider. And what we're noticing is that over time it is moving. And so to us, that's some kind of circumstantial evidence that this is functioning and actually helping fuse. Okay, keep moving. I'll go to a more common, but we can argue how severe it is. Foot and ankle surgeons, some of the ones I've talked to told me they really dislike doing bunion repairs. So I don't know, does anybody know anyone has had bunion repair? Yep, getting more kind of some people maybe in the audience, but that's actually now we're getting more. This is a very common procedure. The reason foot and ankle surgeons don't like it is you go in to get a bunion repair, you say, hey, this is kind of bothering me or it's starting to get painful, can you fix it? If you come back out and it's much worse, that's a really bad outcome, right? And so the surgeon, it's different if you go in and you say, hey, I fell off a swing set, fell off something and I broke my foot. Can you fix it? You're going to generally end up better, right? You're going to go in there and get this fixed. But bunions, it's an elective surgery, so you go in and you kind of do it. And so let me tell you a little bit about it. It's a kind of interesting deformity, but that's what a bunion looks like. And some of you may or may not have some. It's where your toe, the side of your toe comes out. It is more common in women, but it's not only done in women. High heels don't help, make that a little bit worse. So that adds to it, but that's not the root cause of it is not the heels. So what is a bunion? It's actually an angle, it's a bone deformity. So it's not a growth. It looks like a growth, right? You look at it and say, hey, I got something growing on the side of my foot. It's not that. It's actually one of your metatarsals has opened up, right? And so by opening up your metatarsal, that has actually created that bump on the side. And sometimes because it's opened up, the rubbing will cause the bone to grow a little on the side, but the real cause is the movement of that metatarsal. How do they fix it now? I was utterly amazed to see this. The first one's called a bunionectomy and osteotomy. They come in here. They come in and they actually just cut the bone in 2 spots and slide everything over and put 2 screws in. That's called bunionectomy. Very common. Probably people have that if they have one in here. The second option, and by the way, it takes a long time to recover from this. So it takes 3-4 months to recover because you're cutting your bone and your foot is a very important aspect of load bearing. The second one is called a lapidus. If they don't think this will work, the cutting and sliding over, they will fuse you, and that's called a lapidus, called a fusion. They will then take this joint, debride it, and put plates on here and make it where it's just forced to be straight. Both of these have about 3 to 6 month recovery and lots of complications. The real problem with this one is there's no turning back. You get this done, you're basically in a position where you cannot do much after that in terms of moving your foot up, right? It's like having the ankle fusion. But here, ankle fusion, remember you're saying, do I want to have an amputation or a fusion? Here you're saying, do I want to have this annoying bump or lose complete mobility? So it's a tougher choice, I think. So one of the things that people recognize with the bunion, this is a picture a surgeon took for me. I'm not sure if they can normally do this. They must not care about the x-ray, but this is from this is a person with a bunion. Bunions are caused by hypermobility. They're caused by this joint is very mobile. And actually you can see the bunion it's just this joint this metatarsal is just loose, the way to think about it, right? And they call it hypermobility. It's hypermobile in all planes. And because it's loose like that, one of the concepts is why don't we just tether it back? Why don't we just put it back or get something to create it there? And ligaments now hold bones together, right? That's another thing. If you can create a new ligament. So that was one thing we were thinking. It turns out that people have tried this. I'm talking about Arthrex, who made this little thing called the mini tightrope. And they would basically, suture together this and this, right, like this. Any guesses of what happened to this? How did this fail? It didn't work. What would you think would happen to this mini tightrope? Pull through? That was one of the failure modes, right? This thing would actually kind of, these little buttons would tend to pull through. This little bone, one of the other failure mechanisms, this bone would fracture. It's very tiny, and you put a tiny little hole in there, and then you need a big enough hole to get the tightrope through. And so this bone would fracture often, so often that they started having papers come out about it. And so here's a paper on complications of the tightrope, and they said, yeah, we started with a bunion, we ended up having to do a fracture repair because it broke that metatarsal. So what we found was that when patients tolerated it, when the bone didn't break, it worked incredibly well, according to surgeons. So our concept was, all right, if that's the case, can we figure out a way to strengthen that second metatarsal and create that new ligament without actually putting a hole through it? And that's where this 3D printing came in. So at the time, we were doing 3D printing on metal. So we were printing, I'll show you why we use a 3D printed metal, but we were doing this research trying to understand if we print materials versus machine them, what is the window of where that makes financial sense? What are the properties? Because you don't get the same properties. And so we were doing all kinds of things. And if you think about it, here's 3 samples. These are all 3D printed. And by the way, the reason we use 3D printing for this application, you'll see in a second, is we needed a complex geometry that was very small to fit around that metatarsal and strengthen it. But if you look at this, this has a very complex 3-dimensional scaffold. If you went to 3D print this, it would cost the same as this. But you'd be a fool to 3D print this because it would be much better to machine. This, on the other hand, is something with a complex geometry or complex scaffolding. 3D printing is much cheaper, right, and actually impossible. So that's our concept. We were doing these basic studies of looking at, all right, how do these things impact the properties? That's an example of the surfaces you get from 3D printing. That's one that's been treated. That's one as printed. You have a little scaffold of particles on there. By the way, in biomedical applications, that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes you'd like to have a rough surface to integrate, but you may not. These are all same magnification. That's a picture of the macro scaffold that's on this one. And so we were working on this, and I won't go into the detail, but really trying to understand how does these surfaces and these printed things impact stress-strain response. The other big thing that you worry about with a 3D printed metal is if you print the metal, does it have the same fatigue properties, which is something in the application that really is critical long-term. And so this is early data on stress life curve for the 3D printed metals. And obviously, as you add these features, their life goes down. So you pay a price. You can 3D print complex features and shapes, but then you start to lose some fatigue performance. And so that was the research we were doing. And we decided we were going to give this a go for this bunion repair. And so we started looking at, could we print a 3D plate that would fit around that metatarsal and also give you an internal channel to pass the ligament? Because the problem is if you pass the ligament through the bone, it's going to fracture. It's just too small. So we would put this 3D printed plate across the metatarsal, but if you screw, you're back to square one also if you screw the plate in. So if you put the plate in, screw it in, attach the ligament to the plate, you still screwed something into the bone. So we really needed something that did nothing to the bone but encapsulated. And so we made a 3D printed plate with a channel that actually has, this example what you can do with it, there's the CAD design, there's the as printed, you have a pretty rough surface, and we optimize different ways to surface treat it in the bulk. And this is an example where 3D printing makes sense. It's a complex enough geometry and small enough part. To machine this was going to be pretty expensive, especially as we took this window out of the back, and it was going to cost about 5 times as much. And the other thing is you can print all the parts in parallel. So we can print 100 of these in parallel. That's about a 10 by 10 window. The one problem you'll see, and you probably see a lot of discussion of 3D printing in the literature and all these different spots, and people are talking about printing cars. A lot of that stuff's going to be not going to happen. I think there's probably some garbage there. Part of the reason is as parts get bigger, the 3D printing economics really go down. You've got to have parts that are reasonable size. This would fit right in the same complex shape, right in the right size range. Then we did all kinds of studies trying to say, all right, if we, and the basic science was that this is more kind of applied biomechanics, trying to understand if we put this plate on and put a ligament across it, how does it increase the strength? And we could find that we could, increase the strength of that metatarsal a couple times, versus having the hole through the center. So this is the final device. Basically what it does is that's the 3D printed plate, and some people usually ask, is this patient-specific? You can make it patient-specific, but right now your metatarsals are actually all pretty close. It's not a bone that varies massively in shape. And we have two sizes, but it's not that big of a difference. If we ran it across someone with just a massive metatarsal, we could print them just a plate. But that would cost a lot. So this is the way it works. That's my only picture with surgery like that. So the plate goes on that second met. The tendon, new artificial tendon gets looped across there and holds the plate in place through a knot, and then gets looped into the the first metatarsal where you do drill holes. You can drill holes in the first metatarsal. It's strong enough. So let me give you an idea. By the way, there's the couple of different sizes we've made, and those are final printed parts. I'll pass those around if you want to see. I'll pass one on each side. This is what the final printed parts look like. And kind of the size. I'll give you an idea of just one surgery. So comparing surgeries, the first one had 7,000 patients. The second one, we've done 500 patients. It's a small market, so that's a pretty big fraction of the market, actually. This one, we've only done about 100, about 90 patients, and it's in a soft launch, so that's a product that's not nearly as far along. This is some data from the soft launch. I'll just show you one. There's a bunion. There's the x-ray. There's the x-ray after our procedure, so there's the plate sitting on the metatarsal, holding it together, and here's 6 months later. And so I'm showing you a good case. They've all not been this good. I designed that to show you the worst of the case, the worst problem we had was one of the surgeons, and I'm going to blame it on the surgeons. One of the surgeons, we told them they can't bend the plate. The plate didn't fit, so they bent the plate. It's not designed to be bent, and the plate broke into pieces after they closed up and the person was walking around. So that's some of the stuff we have to deal with. And then we had some that failed, just the device it slipped or didn't hold or did something. Some of that happens. So if you look at surgeries, one thing I've become comfortable with as an engineer, it's really hard to get them all to work right. You design everything. It's a little different than I think even designing an aircraft where this failure is just absolutely not a choice, right? You design to like Six Sigma and far out. Here, sometimes things just don't work for reasons you don't know. But thus far, going pretty well. This is a product we're not using at Duke yet, but one we'll probably eventually start looking at. I'm done about 9. I'm going to go over one more. I'm probably going to skip the last one just in the interest of time. I'll show a couple pieces of data here, but this is the least far along of all the projects I've shown. So that I've kind of taken you through a well-known product all the way into something that's new, and we just cleared the FDA for this before. So this is a product for spinal fusion. So if you don't know what spinal fusion is, if you go into the doctor and you have back pain, that's one sign you may need a fusion, but a really common sign of needing a fusion, even more common, is usually arm or leg pain or neck pain. And so what happens there's your cervical spine, which is up here, and then your lumbar spine, which is down here. And when you go into the doctor, if you, particularly, for example, you have pain down your arm or down kind of from your neck down in, a lot of times it means you have some of your spinal discs are being eroded, and the nerves are being pushed on. And you might have a little bulge, or you just have degeneration of your spinal disc, right? And your spine is made up, right, of alternating segments of bone and soft tissue. And that spinal disc is the soft tissue. And when that soft tissue erodes, you end up in a situation where you have pain, and it starts to become really debilitating. You start to get to a point where you really can't move around and do stuff. And so eventually, you have two options. One is to get an artificial disc, spinal disc. Worse clinical results usually than some of the others. I don't want to say it too well. Stefano's not in here, so I can say it. But as many of you know, he actually, one of the fact I remember, he actually had a disc put in. But you have to go outside of the U.S. to get that done usually. Those tend, if they work great, but there's a high failure rate. You know right now. So I think the thing you see with fusions is what they do is they take those two spinal vertebrae, clear out the disc, put in a little cage, and they get those bones to fuse. So now instead of 10 joints, you now have 9. You've killed one of the joints in your spine. You could ask, well, doesn't it, you eventually end up where you can't, move your spine like this? Yes, if you had everything fused, you'd be totally rigid. That doesn't happen for the person probably, well, that maybe some of you would know of, had a spinal fusion, is Peyton Manning. He had a 3-level, he's a quarterback in football. He had a 3-level fusion in his neck. So and he was still playing football. So it can be done. There's still activity after it. So what's the problem that we're trying to address in spinal fusion? If you pick a metal cage, metals are stronger, stiffer, right? and they tend to integrate with bone better. They tend to stick to bone well. So if you put a metal cage in there, it tends to stick better and then integrate a little bit better, which is good. Because I'm going to tell you, if you get a spinal fusion and it doesn't fuse, it's obviously your spine, that's very dangerous, right? And it's not the only thing holding your spine together. You've got a lot of surrounding tissue and muscles, but if your spine really displaces too much, you can be paralyzed and things. So it's a pretty a pretty big issue if you don't have that. So the metal cage works great. The real problem with the metal cage is it doesn't image after that. So, and particularly with an MRI. And so if you go in and say, I have back pain, they image you and they say, wow, one of your vertebrae, one of your discs is in a bad spot. They fuse it, you come back and say, it still hurts. They're like, well, we can't image anymore, that spot. You can't see what's happening anymore. So surgeons moved away from metal cages because of that, because the diagnostics is such an important part of doing this. And so they started moving to PEEK cages. And this is polyethylene or ketone, it's a very high-strength plastic, came from aerospace, kind of trickled down into biomedical, and spinal fusion was the first spot it was used. And this PEEK cage, it's great because it has zero imaging artifacts. You can say, if you say, hey, I'm still in pain, you can go in there and figure out why is it fusing or what's not happening. And also, there's another second argument, but its stiffness is closer to bone. So the argument is that you have a better, thank you, I think that's my line. So the argument is you have a better stiffness relative to bone. The problem is PEEK doesn't like to stick to bone. And so, this cage is probably 30 or 40% of the area that you're putting in there, the rest is bone graft. And so you have a reasonable fraction of the area that's not participating in the fusion, and it makes it a risky endeavor in terms of the fusion. So this has been a dilemma. This is actually, I was just at the NASS conference, which is the North American Spine Society, and they were just talking about this is one of the key issues in spine because they're having a dilemma. They don't want to go back to the metal and bring on the old problem, but they don't want to keep doing this if it's not fusing it. So this is where our newest thing comes in, and what we figured out is why don't we do something to the surface? It's an obvious thing, but and the answer is hard to get to. But why don't we do something to the surface of the PEEK to make it stick to the bone better? And then we don't have to have the metal, and we can have it stick. And so we first tried all kinds of stuff. We were like, well, let's just coat something on there. Let's just sinter some particles, because artificial hips for many years have had titanium beads sintered on them. We just did, and the problem we faced was the PEEK was not taking any of that stuff. Or when we would sinter it on there, it would kill the mechanical properties. And that's really bad in a spinal cage. You need it to bear load. So what we finally discovered was the only way to get PEEK to have a surface finish that would attract the biologics, but also still have good strength, was to force the porosity out from the bulk. So you had to have a continuous layer. So you had to keep, PEEK gets its high strength from crystallinity, and from very large molecular weight and continuity. You have to have that continuity from the porous layer into the bulk. And so we actually figured a way to kind of locally extrude this porous surface out of the base. It's a new processing technique. And what we can do is we can make a whole bunch of different pore scaffolds, and because of the way we extrude it, it's very, very highly porous and also very interconnected. So we did some early behavior. This is in collaboration with some people in biomed at the time on the Georgia Tech, and this is now being recent, so we're now in 2015. And we did a rat segmental defect model. We took an 8mm segment out of the rat femur. And if you ask me any questions about this, I'm not going to know the answers. But if we put in this segmental defect, we put porosity on one side and flat on the other, and lo and behold, what happens is the bone in the PEEK side, in the flat side, it forms a very big fibrous tissue, which is what people have been saying happens with PEEK. But on the porous side, the bone grows right into the pores and attaches itself. And then the nice thing about this model is you can then run little torsion tests on these little, they come out of it, it's the rat sacrifice, and you run little torsion tests. And you pull these little torsion, these little bones, and you can feel how strong is that interface. And the interface with, I don't have the data here for today, but the interface with the smooth PEEK just breaks right off. It's very low strength, whereas the porous PEEK actually gives you an interface as strong as the bone because you kind of have a splining effect there. So we've been doing, that's the biological side. We're also doing a lot of research on, if you know fatigue behavior of materials, the problem with the new surface finish is it kills the fatigue behavior. That's the issue. It's always nice in a biological sense to add something that does something. And what's interesting is, well, PEEK has a really, really unique fatigue behavior. I won't go too much into it because I'm probably more excited about it than most people here. But it's fatigue life is almost 85% of its ultimate tensile strength. And most metals and most materials are usually about 50. So it's much, much stronger in fatigue. So if it doesn't break in fatigue, when you cycle it, it's really hard to get it to break also with that. And when you put the surface porosity on peak, you have a decrease in fatigue life, but it's only a small decrease. And actually, if you compare that to like PMMA, this is bone cement, polymethyl methacrylate. Bone cement has a massive drop in its properties as the stress in the fatigue life as you drop. Sorry, massive increase in fatigue life as you drop the stress. And so porous peak is still, even with the porosity, much stronger than PMMA, which is something people use all the time to kind of fuse and mend bones. So with that data, we decided to try and move forward, and we decided to put this on a spinal cage and see how it worked. I'll pass this last piece around for a couple minutes to kind of put it around. And this is what the cage looks like. We don't have videos anymore. Now we're down. I have this video, but now we're down to drawings. And we just cleared this through the FDA for use in humans about a month ago. So let me show the video. This is kind of cool. It shows you how, it's kind of hard to see from there, but when you drop this into a solution, it will wick up automatically right into there. This is nothing scientific. It's just a capillary effect. But basically, it shows you it's very interconnected porosity. And the idea with this is basically to launch this. We're going to put this into humans, and we will start to then study how well the fusion happens in humans right away. That's one of the things that's scary if you don't know much about med devices. When you clear it with a 510K, you could be the first to get something and you won't know. That's just sort of the way med devices works. And so if it's a pre-market approval or something where they have a formal clinical study, then they ask you, hey, would you like to try this? It's risky. But the FDA with the 510K has decided the risk is low enough. And so like in our part, the risk is pretty low. It does the same function and should attach better. That's the idea. I'm going to stop there. I have one more area, but if actually gives you time, I prefer to just stop at that point, not torture everyone. So thank you all for coming. I'll take questions. I know people have to leave. Feel free to leave and don't feel trapped, but I'll answer any questions.
Who coaches you with these clinical problems, given that you're a professor? Do you see the doctors, or the doctors come find you? And then how do you recruit for the engineers on board? Are the other professors, professionals in the area? Do you bring it to an incubator? How do you work with that process to get from
Early, I was just kind of, sort of ignorantly just minding my own business, and then a couple surgeons asked me to do some stuff, and I realized there might be some opportunity here. That was at Colorado, and then at Georgia Tech, I started setting up more meetings and actively pursuing doctors and looking at their things. Here, it's been even more. Here, my office is nice and close, so we actually are doing more meetings like that. I'm trying to proactively do it now and try to look at different ideas and where can we apply what we've learned there. As far as the engineering, both companies, all these products came through 2 startups. The second one is newer. We have always hired some engineers, either BME or mechanical mostly, and that early in the startup. And those were both funded by angel investors.
Nice talk. In your opinion, what are the current challenges and the limitations of shape memory polymers towards its use in biomedical applications as implants?
I think the biggest challenge is when you thermally activate it, which is their best thing. We do a non-thermal activation. We kind of let this gun trigger do it. When you thermally activate it, it does things to the polymer chemistry that really make it sort of weak long-term in water. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. So you kind of want to use it in a load-bearing application when you use this effect, right? When you open something or do something, but then long-term it tends not to hold up. That, I'd say, is the biggest challenge for a lot of the chemistries. That challenge can be solved. That would be pretty big. And we don't use thermal activation.
Another question. What is your lab currently here and the MEMS department focus on? What is the difference?
We are doing right now. Well, I have 4 students. I have 3 at Georgia Tech right now. And I have 1 here, and our focus mainly is in 3D printing of scaffolds and different materials for load bearing, and then also we're still doing work in the porosity and sort of surface integration. But it's all centered, my lab is all centered on mechanical properties of biomaterials for the most part.
Thank you.
Luker? So this is mainly mechanics and integration by strengthening and so on. So do you plan also like to add some functionality in terms of cellular tissue, probably like sealing the scaffold with some sort of even better integrated? So adding biological functionality.
Yes, yeah, and it would be, I feel like in that kind of project, my role is to build a scaffold that still has the short-term mechanical properties, and then work with people that would do the scaffolding or seating. For example, in the porous peak, you can make any material scaffold. You know, you can really make anything. The hard part is getting to not only the right cells and the things, but also keep some sort of mechanical properties. So in the porous peak case, you really want to look at applications long-term where there's a strong need for mechanical structure. But you also want to start, so we're looking at, when we release antibiotics from some of those scaffolds, and we trap cells and then you have release. But again, for me, that's